Okay, let's get started. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's literary Zoom lecture brought to you by Wharton Library. I'm Michael Bellicosa, Community Engagement Manager here at the library, and I'm very pleased to be introducing this lecture, which is made possible with the support of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley. Because we have a large audience, we'll handle the Q&A at the end as follows. You can send me your questions using the Q&A button, and then I'll relay them to Mark after his lecture. And as usual, Mark is always happy to answer direct questions that you can email him later. People have been doing that very successfully. And if you need his email address, just let me know and I'll pass it along. We're also going to start this like we did last week at Mark's suggestion. After some introductory comments from him, he would like you, using the Q&A button, to just give us your immediate reactions to the Hemingway book. And we'll have a little interaction about that before he continues with his presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Mark. He'll make some comments and then start typing away in that Q&A with your immediate reactions to the book. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that. Thank you, as always, for the invitation and to Westport Library, Wilton Library. Thank you all for attending. I'm happy to see that we're getting good numbers returning. It's hard for me to believe we're already up to the fourth of these 5 books. In Turning to Hemingway and In Our Time, we're doing the second author who's written a book in the 1920s. Winesburg, Ohio is before the war, really, composed before the war. And Anderson is born a good 20 years before the trio of Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and Faulkner, who are all born in the 1890s. And those 3 men are a good generation later than Edith Wharton. Fitzgerald had the misfortune to die at the age of 41, but neither Hemingway, who took his life by suicide and died at 62, or Faulkner, who died in his mid-60s, lived very long. But Hemingway and Faulkner continue to produce important novels after the ones we're looking at. There are many colleges and universities that have English departments and American Studies departments that offer courses in novels of the 1920s. And I know people who aren't in literature who are surprised that a course could be built around a single decade, but I think we're beginning to see why. So In Our Time is a short story cycle, a collection of short stories that functions like a novel, as with Winesburg, Ohio. Some years after this novel, some years after Winesburg, Ohio, Jean Toomer, Toomer, published Cain, 1923, also a short story cycle novel. In 1942, Faulkner published Go Down Moses, the same kind of novel. So before I take your impressions of the book, I'll point out that at this point in our extended conversation about modernism, especially if you've been attending also the British 20th century novels, we see clearly some of the markers of modernism in Our Time. And of course, the title comes from the Book of Common Prayer, where the Lord is asked to give us peace in our time. And that quotation was exploited and at times abused by politicians of different stripes. The In Our Time refers both to the hope for peace and living at this moment in history. This is not a backward-looking novel. So some of the markers are, first and foremost, collage, not only in the sense of a collection of short stories, but there are 15 chapters headed by Roman numerals, which are little italicized excerpts from something. They've come to be called interchapters. There's a similar thing in The Grapes of Wrath. You have the stories, and then you have these 15 insertions. There's a prologue on the quay at Smyrna, and then there's an epilogue, the envoy at the end. But that itself is a collage kind of thing. And those little excerpts in italics with the Roman numerals, you don't even know what sources they're from. There's a series of them near the end that are all about bullfighting, and the last 2 seem to be sequential. But otherwise, we're talking about America and Italy and France and Turkey and Greece, and you don't really know where you are in relation to the one that preceded it. Another aspect of its modernism, in the way we've been talking about, is that many of the stories, even when not explicit, are reactions to the First World War. The war that Hemingway was covering as a journalist, and he chose not to go to college and instead became a cub reporter. He served as an ambulance driver in the First World War, and then he covered as a reporter the Greco-Turkish War that ran from 1919 to 1922, a kind of post-World War I war for Turkish independence. The United Kingdom supported Turkey, Italy, and Soviet Russia supported Greece. That's the war that there are references to in some of the interchapters. So another marker of the novel's modernism is the embrace of the primitive, not only in the elemental quality of war and peace and birth and death. Very tellingly, Indian Camp, one of the most frequently anthologized of the stories from this book, is about the birthing of a baby and the very violent suicide of the man who seems to be the father of that child, all as part of the education of young Nick Adams, who is a surrogate for Hemingway, whose father was a doctor and who Hemingway, young and old, very much admired. And there are scenes at the K at Smyrna with mothers and their dead babies, the same kind of yoking of not just life and death, but the act of birth and death. But another way that the primitive is embraced is the simplicity of language and syntax in Hemingway. People will tell you that Hemingway's style is that he writes in short sentences. That's not completely true. He's capable of writing long sentences. It's just that he writes in sentences that are very spare with respect to adjectives, conjunctions, and coordination. He very rarely says this happened and consequently, subsequently, thereafter. He gets rid of that kind of verbiage. I'm going to give you an example by reading a paragraph from Big Two-Hearted River, Part 1, the end of the book. Those two stories about Nick setting up camp can be seen as this post-World War I veteran doing a kind of therapy by not only returning to nature, but returning to the primitive. This is, I'm reading in my copy of the book from page 137. Even if you have the book with you, I'd rather you just listen and believe me that I'm not making this up. It's on page 137. I'm going to emphasize the word and, A-N-D, which appears 7 times in the 8 sentences of this little passage. Nick slipped off his pack and lay down in the shade. He lay on his back and looked up into the pine trees. His neck and back and the small of his back rested as he stretched. The earth felt good against his back. He looked up at the sky through the branches and then shut his eyes. He opened them and looked up again. There was a wind high up in the branches. He shut his eyes again and went to sleep. 8 sentences, the word and several times, looked up 3 times in the sentence, in the paragraph. That is called a paratactic style, P-A-R-A-T-A-C-T-I, like most figures of speech. It comes from the Greek. It just means putting one thing next to another. Technically speaking, it's putting things side by side without any kind of conjunction. I came, I saw, I conquered is a very good example of the elegant economy of parataxis. That's something that Hemingway does all the time. It's partly because he is terrifically suspicious of high-minded language, because he felt that high-minded language got European empires into the war that killed 21st century young people. So I'll stop there for a moment and I'll ask Michael to come back on and channel for me some of your comments about how you found this book, whether you're a first-time reader of In Our Time or you're returning to it.
Sure. Just a couple of comments so far, so feel free, folks, to get them in. The first person just really liked the book a lot. The second one has got a little more substantive of a comment. I love the book. Each story was small and self-contained. Each story spoke to my heart and to my emotions. I love Hemingway's ability to capture the speech patterns of each character. For example, as the son in My Old Man.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, the idea of the short story, and this is not only a collection of stories, but some of them are truly short, including the one that's called A Very Short Story. And some of that, again, is a kind of embracing of the elemental or the fundamental, the distrust of the grand, of anything epic. The World War was not experienced by any combatant as something global. It was immediate and local and terrible in its immediacy. And some of this eschewing of the great American novel not being a lengthy novel is a distrust of the grand, of the epic, in many of these writers' works. So I'll say some, yeah, do you want to have others, Michael?
No, well, you continue, and then I just got another one.
No, I'll let you go because I'm done with that point.
Okay. Well, we got a couple of big thumbs up votes for Big Hearted River, but this person also chimed in that she enjoyed the stories of lone men in nature, for example, Big Two Hearted River, but not so much those that focus on relationships between men and women.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to know what you didn't enjoy about the men and women, but I will say that this is Hemingway's first published novel. He did a trial run the year before, very much pared down, only 32 pages total, that didn't have all the stories. It had the interchapters. That was a kind of dry run at trying to be a novelist. It was privately printed. And he added 4 new stories and a number of stories that had been published elsewhere. And one of the things he's trying to do in this first book is show that he can write about something other than the war that he fought in and the second war, the Greco-Turkish War, that he reported on. And he knew that to be a major novelist, you have to write about men and women. And he has a book later on called Men Without Women. But he's testing out his idea of whether he could be a serious fiction writer. Fitzgerald was so impressed with what he read of Hemingway that he urged Hemingway to drop his publisher and join with Fitzgerald in Scribner's. And although they remained friends for the remainder of Fitzgerald's short life, it was a contentious friendship. But I agree. There's a reason why the Big Two-Hearted River gets 2 parts, that it's long, and it's at the end. And fundamentally, it's because it shows you Nick doing therapy for his trauma, spending more time on the cure of going back to nature. That's an old American meme or type, the idea of going into the wilderness, of going back to basics. You may have noticed that there are several references in the interchapters to gardens or garden walls. And Fitzgerald's not interested in the garden. Garden is just another name for civilization. It's a domesticated nature. He's interested in the wilderness for reasons I'll explain in a few minutes. Do you want to do one more, Michael, or shall I start the lecture?
I do. I have one more. I
Good.
love the book. I love the book. People were real, doing ordinary things, whether quiet or violent. They weren't immersed in what to wear or losing their wealth and wringing their well-manicured hands.
Yes. So I won't ask that reader how he or she feels about Fitzgerald, but you see that you would never mistake a page of Fitzgerald for a page of Hemingway. very radically different responses. For one thing, they were born in different social sets, and both of them reflect a reality of the 1920s as they knew it and as the America experienced it. So in addition to the elemental quality of the syntax and the style, I began by saying it's elemental too in the way that Homer is elemental about life and death and war and peace. Hemingway said that in trying to write his first piece of fiction, he was commencing, quote, with the simplest things, and one of the simplest things of all, and the most fundamental, is violent death. And that's a quote. Commencing with the simplest things, and one of the simplest things of all, and the most fundamental, is violent death. So death is in the so-called interchapters, those 15 italicized sections headed with Roman numerals, in both War and Peace. And of course, it's in many of the stories. In more than one place, violent death is intimately associated or even linked with birth, as in, as I said, Indian camp, or the dead babies and their mothers on the dock in that prologue story on the quay at Smyrna, and other places in the stories. Hemingway believed in his fiction and in his life that there must be a way to find some, quote, ordered, formal, passionate disregard of death. Ordered, formal, passionate disregard of death. He's not talking about the renunciation of something like a Buddhist state or a kind of release or negation of emotion. That word passionate is important. He's committed passionately to the ordered and formal disregard of death. Well, the only way you can disregard something is by noticing it first. In his writing, this resulted, as I tried to demonstrate in general, in the famous paratactic style, one thing after another, with very little syntactic fanfare. I read an example from Big Two-Hearted River. I want to say in another of his novels from the 20s, A Farewell to Arms, which I could just as easily have done in place of this novel, 1929, one of the first American novels to critically engage in the First World War. The late 20s in Europe and America, and to some extent in England, was the beginning of having enough distance between the end of the war and the present day for people to write about the war in other than patriotic terms. This paragraph has 4 sentences and has the word "and" 15 times. I'm not going to emphasize it when I read. That may be annoying, but you'll hear it. This is how the book A Farewell to Arms starts. In the late summer of that year, we lived in a house in a village that looked across the river and the plain to the mountains. In the bed of the river, there were pebbles and boulders, dry and white in the sun, and the water was clear and swiftly moving and blue in the channels. Troops went by the houses and down the road, and the dust they raised powdered the leaves of the trees. The trunks of the trees too were dusty, and the leaves fell early in that year, and we saw the troops marching along the road, and the dust rising, and leaves stirred by the breeze falling, and the soldiers marching, and afterwards the road bare and white except for the leaves. So leaves appears 4 times in that paragraph, 3 times in the same sentence, and you could hear that some of those sentences are long. This is the style that Hemingway almost single-handedly crafted, and he is very suspicious of adverbs, adjectives, and intensifiers. Mainly somebody is hungry, as he says of Nick, or maybe very hungry. But you won't find Hemingway typically writing that he was famished or starving. He is not a big fan of simile, because simile talks about one thing that is here in terms of another thing that's not here. If I say with Robert Burns, my love is like a red, red rose, my love is here in the context of the poem, The rose was brought in by the poet. The rose does not exist as a thing in the world that the poet is talking about. Hemingway's elementalism is that he wants to embrace the stuff that's actually here. He very assiduously avoids the abstract. And so the result, heavy on nouns and light on adjectives and adverbs, feels like a children's first reader repeating over and over again the same word like leaves instead of a synonym or a pronoun. He has a studied avoidance of the abstract, and that's certainly true of Hemingway. By contrast, Fitzgerald is a romantic. He is very influenced by Keats and is loaded with intensifiers and synonyms and adverbs and adjectives. So that's what Hemingway believed was how you try to conquer or disregard depth in this elemental controlled prose. In life, he believed ardently that the individual must respond to the meaninglessness of violence that we find in the world by actively engaging with it and controlling it. And here, this is not for everyone's taste, including mine, chiefly through hunting and fishing and bullfighting and writing. Hemingway was not suggesting that everyone do that any more than he was suggesting that everyone write the way he writes. But he embraced that absolutely as a way of life and as one of the ways that he himself would face life. So this idea of the physical, the manly in the limited sense of what we're talking about when we make general assumptions about bullfighting, hunting, fishing in the 1920s, in the same way that the Rhodes Scholarship used to have a component about high manhood, and you couldn't get that scholarship if you were just bookish. You had to be physical in the sense that people associated in the 19th century with vigorous Christianity and vigorous citizenship. So there's a passage on page 134, again in the first part of the Big Two-Hearted River, where we're told that Nick walked along the road feeling the ache from the pull of the heavy pack. The road climbed steadily. It was hard work walking uphill. His muscles ached and the day was hot, but Nick felt happy. He felt that he had left everything behind, the need for thinking, the need to write, other needs. It was all back of him. And one of the things he's going to do by putting all that behind him, including the unspoken war, Big Two-Hearted River begins with a paragraph that talks about, as he's writing, a burned over country. Burned over country. That is a kind of wasteland, like the Valley of Ashes under Dr. Eckelberg's big billboard in The Great Gatsby. And what he's going to embrace instead is the wilderness. Big Two-Hearted River, part 2, ends with the word swamp, not a garden, but the opposite of a garden that is completely disordered, unorganized, apparently, nature. But to a biologist, an ecologist, an environmentalist, a swamp is not only teeming with life, it is a whole system of organization that people miss. So another part of the idea of this control of what disregard of death, which you cannot control, you can't make it go away, is by controlling the things you can, is the idea of process as therapy. Some of you may know, either through your own experience as an occupational therapist or a caregiver, or you may know from being a patient, that one of the ways people become whole again is by relearning very simple things like tying a shoe or making a peanut butter sandwich. I had a very dear friend in graduate school who suffered a head injury because of an automobile accident. And she was terrified of anything that suggested closure, from closing a door to hanging up the phone to putting a letter in a postal box. And her final examination, as it were, for her course of therapy was to walk out in the street. I was with her to put a letter in a mailbox, which for months before she couldn't bring herself to do. So here's a description in part one on page 138 of Nick building his own camp. I won't read all of it, but if you're interested in this, you could read paragraph after paragraph on page 138 and 39. With the axe, this is the bottom of 138, with the axe, he slid off a bright slab of pine from one of the stumps and split it into pegs for the tent. He wanted them long and solid to hold in the ground. With the tent unpacked and spread on the ground, the pack, leaning against a jack pine, looked much smaller. Nick tied the rope that served the tent for a ridgepole to the trunk of one of the pine trees and pulled the tent up off the ground with the other end of the rope and tied it to the other pine. The tent hung on the rope like a canvas blanket on a clothesline, one of the few similes. We see what he's talking about. Nick poked a hole in the pole he had cut up under the back peak of the canvas and then made it a tent by pegging out the sides. He pegged the sides out taut and drove the pegs deep, hitting them down into the ground with the flat of the axe until the rope loops were buried and the canvas was drum tight. To my students, God bless them, their eyes glaze over when they read that, unless they themselves are camping enthusiasts. But very late in the novel, Hemingway is on to something. Just as Nick's trauma about the war is not made explicit, Krebs is one of the characters in the book who's an explicit kind of PTSD case, person who feels alienated in his own home. It's called Soldier's Home as a pun, as the soldier is home, but he has been so prematurely aged that it's as if he's in a soldier's home, a veteran's hospital. Just as Amory does not confront what happened to him in the war, but is maybe playing it out in other ways. This novel suggesting that the basic thing about setting up a camp and how to do it has a cleanness, a salutary aspect that some people enjoy when you watch how-to shows, even though you have no intention of baking that cake or making that bookcase. I am one of the unhandiest people you will ever meet, but I am fascinated when people tell me in person or through the internet how to do something. And I fear that I've insulted or hurt some people's feelings when they offer me the instruments and say, would you like to try now? And I say no. And when I was a young person, they always assumed it was because I was fearful that I would do it wrong, which only made them encourage me more. Actually, I wasn't interested in doing it, which sounds snobbish. I wanted to know how it was done, and I enjoyed having it explained or showed because there's a kind of completeness to son of a gun. Look, you do what she says, and at the end of it, you have a tulip or whatever it might be. That's what he's getting at. And any one of those of you in this Zoom room, which I now see is up to 79 people, who has ever experienced a kind of chaos or maybe actual psychic or psychiatric trauma or medical, physical trauma, knows how comforting it can be to just talk about very basic things. That's why children love a story where one thing happens and then another thing's happened and then another thing happens. That's the Hemingway style. It's everywhere in his work when he's talking about the therapeutic aspects of what he's about. So I'll do one more and then I'll stop for comments and questions at the bottom of the hour. This is page 147. In the pack, he found a big onion. He sliced it in two and peeled the silky outer skin. Then he cut one half into slices and made onion sandwiches. He wrapped them in oiled paper and buttoned them in the other pocket of his khaki shirt. He turned the skillet upside down on the grill, drank the coffee, sweetened and yellow-brown with the condensed milk in it, and tidied up the camp. It was a good camp. Last sentence of that paragraph. It was a good camp. Not a great camp, not a fantastic, not the best camp. It was a good camp, by which he means terrific, but he doesn't use that word. In Beowulf, the highest praise you can give to your king is to say, that was a good king. Why not a great king? Because to raise the rhetoric is to cheapen the compliment. I've said this before on others of these Zoom meetings. If you know Yiddish, whether you're fluent or not, you know that it's not proper to say he was a very good mensch. He was a great mensch. Mensch means a good human being, and that's enough. We in English refer to the Bible, some of us, as the good book, but the word Bible just means book. It's a book. When the French Revolution stormed the Bastille, which had been used as a prison, the word Bastille in French means building, just a building. Its elemental power, its tyranny, was in the simplicity of the word building, just as the elegance of the compliment to the king is to call him a good king, or to praise one's humanity by saying, you're a human being, without flourish, fanfare, or adjectives. Okay, Michael, I'll go back to you.
Okay, Mark. We've comment. I am delighted that in The Cat in the Rain, the woman got what she wanted. She got the cat in the rain. I'm upset about how the Indian woman is treated in Indian camp, but I hope Hemingway was on her side.
Yeah, I will say that you can look at literature a lot closer to our day than 1920 and be very disappointed about the treatment of women, even in great and apparently enlightened writers. And the same thing's true for hyphenated Americans or people with melanonin in their skin. I do think Hemingway has a broad acceptance of many things within his view of the world. And I'm reminded that when Henry James, an American writer we have to recall, responded to the criticism that someone said of his novels, to enjoy them, you have to recognize that he ignores about 85% of human life. That is, people typically don't work for a living. They typically don't have illness or children. They don't have tax problems. It's a very rarefied view. And the critic said, a professional literary critic, you have to throw out about 85% of life. And Henry James said, God bless him, every novelist ignores 85% of life. It's just a different 85%. Nobody does everything. Jack London, Mark Twain, they wrote about things that Henry James didn't, but they didn't write about what Henry James wrote about. So yes, there's plenty of criticism to be levied against the different reactions to different people. But when you consider that in this handful of stories, the tonal changes in catching people's accents and voices, the fecundity of different plots and imagination, the audacity of splicing in between these statements about executions, one early shooting men lined up against the wall, one who is so impaired he can't stand up, and then later on hanging men, one who is so impaired he has to be stood up. There's certainly something in that echo about executing early and late, the first in war, the second in some kind of penal institution, half a dozen and then 5, and the idea that even when they're not well enough to stand on their own, they'll still be shot or hanged. And we've all seen movies or read novels or read nonfiction works in which if you're condemned to die and you're feeling under the weather, they will postpone the execution until you're well enough to be executed while you're healthy, so that the punishment takes its full measure. when Hemingway is talking about the violence of death, he just doesn't mean in martial terms. He's talking about capital punishment and all other kinds of accidental and intentional killing.
Sure. Oh, we just got another one. The imagery in the descriptions of Nick setting up his campsite and the entire passages of his camping experience are like a stark and beautiful painting.
I could not agree more. I want to say I appreciate that comment. He says about descriptions in Farewell to Arms that the town was nice and the house was fine. And you will see that the good and the fine and the nice and someone being happy or tired or hungry without synonyms for those words is very common in Hemingway. And it's easily parodied. And if you're someone whose taste, either through your past experience or just your sensibility, runs to the more Rococo, if you enjoy the kind of eloquence that you find in Fitzgerald or Edith Wharton, you'll find yourself stymied by the paucity in Anderson and Hemingway. If you want Rococo, come back next week when we do Faulkner, who never met an adjective he didn't like and believes in syntactical complication and rhetorical flourishes. He's writing in a much different style. His style is more like Melville, Milton, and the Bible. It's very, very oratorical.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, just another one. I'm interested to understand why the short war stories were included and juxtaposed with the other stories. They were gripping and wrenching and violent. How do you see those stories within the entire book of stories?
Yeah, well, if we remember that this is his first attempt to make a novel, he was first writing what he knew. For he was working for the Toronto Star. He started writing as a teenager, as a cub reporter. And when he was sent to cover this war after serving as an ambulance driver and being wounded just or things that he read in the paper that he was writing for. And he thought that he would use them to give the flavor of our time, and that our time is most emphatically a time of war, whether it was the First World War or this sort of post-war war. So that when he's writing in our time, peace in our time, he's giving the public what he knows in little snippets, in the same way that when John Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath, the narrative about the Joad family is the major part of the novel. But in between those narrative chapters that he created, John Steinbeck reports on the Depression and the Dust Bowl and what's happening in America factually to make the case that his fiction, no matter how moving, is never far removed from the reality of the Great Depression. It's not, I think, that Hemingway does not have the confidence to leave the nonfiction behind. It's not that he's putting it in to say, look what I can do, because the stories are actually quite accomplished. Indian Camp, Big Two-Hearted River, Early and Late are fine pieces of prose. I think that he wants to remind his readers that in our time, these things are happening. Like someone who would want to write a novel now about the geopolitical world and wanting to remind us, as if we needed reminding, what's happening in Ukraine. I think that's what he's doing. He's trying to ground the fiction, the stuff that's made up, in the stuff that's real. And in fact, like T.S. Eliot and like James Joyce, and like Fitzgerald in This Side of Paradise, he's using his own autobiography, objectified, written as a kind of biography. Nick Adams is very much a stand-in for Hemingway in the same way that Stephen Dedalus is a stand-in for James Joyce and Amory is a stand-in for Scott Fitzgerald.
Great. You want to just continue, Mark?
Yeah, I'll continue for a little bit more, and then I'll say that I'm hopeful that we'll have more from the participants. I say this in part because you remember that those of you who've been good enough to be with me for a while, and I think Michael and I started back in 1947 or 48, I think we're somewhere in there, that there were often presentations I gave that in the hour that I had for Ulysses or the Odyssey, I really didn't have much bandwidth for questions and answers. I'm more generous tonight because I have less to say that's complicated. I hope what I've said was not surprising to you. Whereas with Sound and the Fury, especially if you're new to that novel, or especially if you're new to Faulkner, is going to be a little more heavy lifting for me, which I'm happy to do. So I'll just say a couple of more things. And one is Hemingway had an iceberg theory, is what he called it, an iceberg theory of writing, which is that good prose should have, quote, the dignity of the movement of an iceberg with only 1/8 of its being above water. That the reason an iceberg could have dignity, could be so stately, so formidable, is that the visible part of it is only a fraction of what exists. And he meant in his prose that even though he's giving you very little, that his prose is spare and that many things are intimated at, like a good poem. We recognize the dignity, the substantial subject of something like Indian Camp, when Nick asks those tentative questions about what it's like to die and is it easy, and his having what would be, for many people, a rite of passage into life and death in this surprisingly immediate way, going to deliver a baby with his father and seeing a man cut himself from ear to ear. And still it ends with the fact that he feels he will never die early in the book, because that's what all adolescents should believe. I had an exchange with someone in one of my groups recently, I confess it may have been this group, who was talking about high school books and, oh yes, it was this. It was whichever patron wrote about finally catching up with a copy of Winesburg, Ohio, and rereading it and still not loving it, but appreciating it better than when she read it in high school or earlier. I'm sorry if I'm getting the details foggy, but I'm old. And one of the comments I made is that I'm not sure I would be in favor of assigning Winesburg, Ohio to middle school or high school readers, in the same way that I'm not in favor of assigning tragic literature or absurdist literature or really grim books to adolescents. I think they have plenty of grimness to deal with. You can teach them to appreciate great literature and reading and writing with things that are more lighthearted, less somber. I mean, they can read something like The Scarlet Letter because Puritanism and the Salem colony seems far enough in the past. But it's better to wait until they're older, when they can really appreciate things like their mortality or the passing of their parents or something else. Literature has a lot to teach you, but you have to have learned something first to let it teach you what it does. So I'll leave that there, but to say that there is a kind of poetry to Hemingway, not in the elegance of his syntax or diction, but in the spareness, the economy of doing more with less. It's like the poetry of someone like E.E. Cummings or Emily Dickinson.
Got it. So we had a comment earlier that relates to your comment about Nick doing therapy on himself by going to his fishing haunts, and the person said that she has a relative who is an excellent fly fishing guide in Colorado, who recovered himself from opioid addiction by getting into that and doing that. And then she followed that with a comment about Nick, saying that he always releases the fish he catches, and he's concerned. He seems to be concerned about the health of the trout to the extent that he dries his hands before touching it, so that he doesn't create, that it doesn't get the fungus infection.
Yes. I'm not a Hemingway admirer in terms of his biography. He was one of those people who kind of snuck up on me. I realized after I was teaching for a good long while that I really admired The Sun Also Rises, and I really admired A Movable Feast, and I really admired A Farewell to Arms, and the same with In Our Time. And Son of a Gun, before I knew it, I thought, gee, I really like Hemingway's writing. But the myth of Hemingway and the macho stuff of Hemingway, I came to Old Man and the Sea rather late. I admired that too. But he did change his views of things and got darker as he got older. He committed suicide with a shotgun. But in his earlier life, like many people who embrace fishing and hunting, he had a kind of conservationist attitude towards it. But it's harder for me to connect to the bullfighting and the more rampant macho-ness, which clearly has an embracing of violence. He said that the reason he was so drawn to bullfighting is that when the war was over, he still wanted to feel the crisis, the determining crisis of somebody facing death in an arena. And, if you take seriously what he said that I quoted earlier, and you believe that violent death is everywhere in life, you don't need a bullfight. Hemingway, Fitzgerald found it in Dick Humbert's automobile accident. And we found it in Indian camp, which had nothing to do with war. I think that Hemingway in his life became a victim of his own distorted myth. And so I don't think of myself as someone who is an expert in Hemingway, but I do admire what he did with his prose. I do think that what I've been saying about the therapy of process is very Hemingway. In the opening pages of A Farewell to Arms, they're talking about a priest who comes by the camp, and it says, my friend motioned for him to come in. The priest shook his head and went on. That night in the mess, after the spaghetti course, which everyone ate very quickly and seriously, lifting the spaghetti on the fork until the loose strands hung clear, then lowering it into his mouth, or else using a continuous lift and sucking it into the mouth. Well, that's an odd thing. This was after the spaghetti course, and he troubles to tell us on page 6 of the novel that the men had 2 ways to eat it. Putting it above your head and lowering the loose strands into your mouth, or sucking it into your mouth from below. Remarkable that he would bother. And then helping ourselves to wine from the grass-covered gallon flask. It swung in a metal cradle, and you pulled the neck of the flask down with the forefinger, and the wine, clear red, tannic, and lovely, poured out into the glass held with the same hand. After this course, the captain commenced picking on the priest. So the priest is there, and then the priest is put aside until he can explain the 2 ways visually that spaghetti gets eaten, in case you're new to this planet. And then he explains something about the intricacies of the way you have to drink the wine. It's not to say that those things aren't interesting of themselves, but when you're reading a novel that you expect to have a flow of story, you wonder, what's the point of having the priest step in? And then the spaghetti meal is already over. But to tell you, it's because there is this imperative to embrace the concrete, the practical. When he describes the men being hanged, he talks about the weight and the ball bearing, that is in the drop door. Maybe you remember that. I won't, with so little time left, I won't try your patience by my finding it. But he actually says something about the heft and the ball bearing on which the door, the trap door works. That's Hemingway. Put your trust in things, in stuff, and be very suspicious of anything immaterial. Sometimes that's good advice.
Yeah. So this person is asking, can you please say some more about Hemingway's depiction of women in stories, for example, Mr. and Mrs. Eliot?
Well, I'm gonna pass on that for two reasons. One is I'm hopeful that anyone who is attentive to the stories will come to their own consideration of what Hemingway's treatment of those characters are. And that's a sincere avoidance for pedagogical reasons. And I will also say that, as I explained some weeks ago, I think of this as a topographical, that is the lay of the land of the modern American novel in the 20s. And so I don't pretend in an hour or less, if we count these questions and answers, to be able to cover a single novel completely or the 15 stories in it. So although I have a very good sense of this novel, I have not recently reread that story, and I wouldn't want to trust my memory. And I hope that doesn't strike anyone as an evasion. If we were in a different kind of course, we might spend 2 or 3 meetings on this novel. And then we would, of course, I would have warned you ahead of time, we're going to give special attention to Mr. and Mrs. Smith and Indian Camp and X, Y, or Z. I'm hopeful, again, that that's not too frustrating an answer to that question. If you have a particular question about your read of it and want me to compare it to mine, if you send it to me, I will reread the story before I answer you. But I can't do that now.
Sure. So the person who asked earlier or made the comment earlier about being upset about the way the Indian woman was treated or depicted in the Indian camp, she says, could you please explain more in relation to my earlier comment, whether or not you feel Hemingway is being an early feminist against the way the Indian woman in labor was called a squaw?
Yeah. So again, that's a story I know well and have taught to undergraduates. I can't imagine that I could ever say the sentence, Hemingway was an early feminist, and be convincing. His loyalty is not to the woman, it's to Native Americans. As someone with his background and doing a lot of work, hunting, fishing, hiking in the countryside, his connection to the Indians of the Midwest, like later on his connection to people of mixed blood and different cultures when he lived in Cuba, is very powerful. But I'm not sure it favors women over men. And I certainly don't think that even a momentary sympathy for someone of a particular gender not being demeaned counts as feminism. So I'd separate myself from any sense that Hemingway was a feminist early or late, but he does have, like many people, an affinity for other people when he knows them. And I'll give this example that I've given often, and I've encountered this in my life. I know people from my background in Queens and Brooklyn who were raised to be unthinking racist through and through, and would say things about whatever people they didn't feel good about without even realize that that's an expression you shouldn't say about those people. And they wouldn't even realize it. And then their sister needed a home aide, and that was a Black woman from Trinidad who my relative, the person who had been so racist, would not have said a good thing about ever. And now that woman, Adele, who now is taking care of my aunt's sister or sister-in-law, is the salt of the earth, not just because she's doing a kindness, but because my aunt now knows her as a person and could never make the connection that previously calling those people whatever would be true of Adele, because Adele is Adele. That level of appreciation, I'm not sure that Hemingway had, but he certainly was close enough with Native Americans in the Midwest and with Cubans and other people. You know, the Caribbean is loaded with non-white people of different variations, that he would have thought of them as people. But again, I'm not so sure he would privilege women over men or even make them equal. So
Sure.
I'll have one time for one more, Michael.
Well, it's a question that is raised quite a bit, I think, when looking at older books in particular. She says it's fair to comment on Hemingway's treatment of women in the book, but then does it really make sense to judge this treatment by today's standards?
Yeah. So this is a challenge always, because on the one hand, if you don't judge a book by our standards today, you're making it a kind of fossil or artifact from history. That is one of the things we read literature for, is classics never read like yesterday's news. So there is a way in which I think it's perfectly acceptable to recognize that there's anti-Semitism in The Merchant of Venice, and it's not just something we say to calm the sensibilities of our Jewish friends or people like me who are not Jewish but care about Jewish people, like all of us. But at the same time, you have to keep that in mind as a separate consideration to the power of the prose or the poetry or the drama as you read it. So I do think to have a kind of bifocal vision, in Huckleberry Finn, I think you could argue that the humanity of Jim comes through, despite the fact that Twain uses the N-word, which didn't have the resonance for him that it has for us. More strikingly, Jim is treated often like a little kid, like not a full man, like a boy. But there's a scene where Huckleberry Finn abuses Jim by making him believe that a little storm that happened was something that Jim dreamt. And he, who is a lot sharper, cleverer than Jim and more educated, not a better person necessarily, but more educated, pulls this prank on Jim. And Jim realizes it because he looks around and he sees the detritus of the storm and branches and leaves, and he realizes that the storm he dreamt was an actual storm. And he scolds Huck like the parents he does not have, and he goes over to the other side of the raft. And what does Huck say? That he has to admit he never thought he could be so shamed by an N-word. That is, he's smart enough to know, he's good enough to know that he was wrong to do what he did, and that the moral high ground goes to Jim. But he still calls him by the N-word, and he can't believe that such a person could make him feel shamed. That's the double dealing in something like Huckleberry Finn, which I don't think is a racist book, but has racism in it. And the other challenge in response to this very good question is, if you are too accepting of the biases of the past, and you're in a position to speak to them, to people who lean in that other direction, or you're teaching it to younger people, even people of college age, you have to be very careful not to have your enlightened acceptance seem like approval. And that's really important. It's really important to remember that you may know more about the implications of the word squaw, or to use the word Jew as a verb. I had a member of my extended family who would talk constantly about Jewing somebody down. And when I called it to her attention, she never connected it with Jewish people. It's just a verb she learned. And her appellation for the Chinese takeout was the chinks, and she never thought that was a bad word. And when I was a young person, Oriental was not a bad word, and now it is. Those are things that some people need to be reminded of because they're not aware of the history of why that word would be offensive, why squaw would not be necessarily a good word, or the notion that when you meet someone from another culture, you ask them to perform for you, even though that's not what you call it. Oh, say something in Italian. I think it's such a beautiful language. Talk a little bit so we can get a flavor of your culture. Can be demeaning. So it's a complicated question. I do want to invite you, if I've left anyone unsatisfied, as so often I do, I'm told, in my personal life, to write me, and I will do my best to answer you quickly and as fully as I can. I want to end, as always, with, again, thanking Michael and the library and all of you for showing up again and again. And all I can say that if you are still making your way through The Sound and the Fury, like Ulysses, it's more like other books than it is not like other books. And if you read and keep reading, even though if you're confused, if nothing else, you will eventually get to the end. and that's not a small thing. The last section, so the first section narrated by Benji, the person who is the tale told by an idiot, the person who is impaired, that's a very hard one to follow. The next section narrated by his brother Quentin, who is a suicide, is someone who is very troubled, and that complicates the narration. The third section by the other Compson brother is the most straightforward. Jason, who's filled with hate, which typically doesn't affect his narration the way that the cognitively impaired or the very psychologically marred two brothers. And then the last section is like fresh air. It's more narratively accessible, and it includes Dilsey. And the last two words of the novel give the final judgment. So it does get less confusing, I think, as you go, but there is some profit in thinking just getting to the end will be its own kind of satisfaction. It is one of those novels like Ulysses, you can never completely get with a single or even 2 or 3 times reading, but I hope the power of it affects you as you read it, and you see how far the modern American novel has come from Anderson and certainly from Edith Wharton.
Well, thanks for the encouragement, Mark, on that. I'm sure we can all use. I'm sure we can use some on the way to the end of that book. It's a fantastic book, and it's definitely worth the effort. So thanks everybody for attending. Thanks, Mark, for another great session. We are hoping, Mark and I, to be able to tell you next week what our next series is going to be. We're working on it right now. So we hope to see you all next week, and we'll conclude this, and hopefully we'll give you a heads up about the one coming up after that. Enjoy your evening, folks.
Stay well, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Michael.